Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me, whether you are watching live or watching the recording. Today we're talking more about responsive CSS. I got a little bit ahead of myself last week and covered a lot of material, but that means this week we don't have to cover as much material, so we're in good shape there. I just want to primarily talk about CSS Grid today. Last week we looked at Flex and did a little example with Flex, as well as some other responsive CSS properties. Today we're going to look at Grid in a little more depth, talk about how that works, do a little example with Grid. Probably get done a little early today. We'll see how long it takes us. Either way, right, we'll get started with a few announcements today. One is that our usual Open Lab study hall session on Thursdays is canceled for this week. I will not be here. I will be out of town at a cybersecurity conference toward the mountains. So I'll be out most of the day Thursday and most of the day Friday. So there will be no Open Lab this week. However, next week we'll be back to regular schedule. That's what that message that I sent out earlier today was all about, if you all saw that. So today, I think that's the only announcement that I really have. Today I have more to talk about when it comes to responsive CSS. We're going to talk about CSS Grid. So before we do that, let's kind of remind ourselves of one of the concepts that we discussed last week. And that was kind of the difference between Flex and Grid, right? Because last week we looked at Flex with a little bit of depth, and this week we're talking about Grid. So let's go ahead and compare the two here. Once again, with just a little reminder, we said Flexbox is a 1D layout tool, and we saw that happen when we were doing our example last week, right? Like we saw that as we made a site, if we went over the width, it would just go down to the next row. But we really only had the ability to kind of dictate how things happen in a particular row. Whereas with Grid is a 2D layout tool, which means we can work with both columns and rows. Right, so as we were working with Grid today, we have a 2D layout tool that we'll be using here to lay our sites out. So with CSS Grid, we're going to use our display property, right? We can kind of see here that once we are defining a container for CSS Grid, we are creating a container and we are defining that container using a display property. And so if we were to work with our CSS Grid here, the big thing that we would be looking at would be that we need some sort of container. So let's switch over to full here for a moment, get into Visual Studio Code, and start working here. So we need some sort of container. So what we might use here is a main for our container. So now we're using our main as a wrapper. We can put anything else that we need inside of our main. I might even give it an ID. And in our ID, I can call it maybe Grid Container. Right? And that just gives it a very specific ID name that's going to call out that this is our grid container when we're going back and we're looking at our code later. So by default here in our CSS, if I focus my hashtag for grid underscore container selector here, so that's our ID grid selector. To make this container into a grid container, I just need to run display grid in here as a rule. right? And so one of the things that we'll see as we're working with grid today is that some of the things we are applying to the container and some of the things we are going to be applying to the children of the container. As we're kind of going forward here. So what we're looking at here is we're basically looking at some, forgot to hide that. What we're basically looking at here is we're basically looking at a particular understanding of the DOM for us to get into our grid a little bit better. Right? Most of the CSS attributes for grid are applied to the parent container. All right, as we kind of work through our grid example here, we'll see that. And so when we establish all of these attributes will impact all of the children of that container. So our grid container in our example, we'll put some elements in it. The elements can be all sorts of different things, right? They can be headings, they can be paragraphs, they can be sections, they can be basically anything. Right, and it's going to allow us to use the same rules for our heading, or for each of these elements that are a child of this container. And we can nest subchildren into each of these parts, right, which would be grandchildren of our parent container here, and they would just kind of flow accordingly, right? So we have some different elements that are important that we'll kind of go through as we're getting into utilizing this grid. Now, what we saw already is that we're going to be working with the display grid to kind of change the way this works, right? By default, it's display block. So if we're using something that's a little bit different, we want to change it up to display block, right? You know, we've had this, kind of discussion in previous classes where we have inline elements and block elements, and how block elements have the box model block that goes all the way across the screen. Inline elements are things like images and video files and audio files and links that fit the content. And so now we're kind of introducing a brand new display to this, and we used a different display last week as we were working with Flex as well. We used display Flex for that. So it's the similar thing here, right? We're going to put that on the parent. And so from here, one of the easiest things for me to do is we can say, well, we can make a template. We can establish templates for our grid for both rows and columns. So we can take the grid template and we can make this template whatever we want it to be. And so as we are building templates, one of the best things about that is that we have these items of where our template, of where our row starts, where our row ends, and how we can use all of these things. And so by default, we can kind of use some of the things that we started working with last week, right? Like things like viewport width, viewport height, all that kind of fun stuff. However, something more important that we can talk about in a little bit, or something that's easier for me that we can talk about in a little bit, that I hope is easier for all of you, is the idea of frames. But let's start out by just jumping into our code here and just making a few containers and just seeing how this works. Right, so what I'm going to do is inside of this container, I'm just going to make a few sections. Section. We'll give it a class of red. And I want to have a few different sections here just so we can see them different visually. We'll do one that's red, one that's yellow. Right, so let's do section class equals yellow. And let's do one that's blue. Section class equals blue. So now in our CSS, let's go add some rules to our CSS. One of the things that we've already forgotten to do to our CSS is to add our reset rules in here. So let me go ahead and add that. I will just do an asterisk there. We will do margin 0, and we will do box sizing, border box, and we'll go ahead and set this to a sans serif font family. So font dash family sans serif. All right. So now inside of my grid container here, I have 3 boxes. Before I set my grid template, though, I probably want to actually add these colors in here. So dot red, we'll give it a background color of red. Dot yellow, we'll give it a background color of yellow. And finally, dot blue, we'll give it a background color of blue. Now, if we look at our site by default here, right, we can look at it in a live server. So let's open up live server here. Right now, we see absolutely nothing here. Right, there's nothing on my page yet. That's because none of my section items here actually have any sort of height or width set to them. We're going to set some width to them and some height to them based on our grid. Right? So instead of establishing maybe some min height, some width in another element here, what I'd rather do is I'd rather use my grid template to be able to do that. So as we're creating a grid, essentially what we're thinking about here is we're thinking about it in terms of, grid lines on a piece of grid paper, if you've ever done graphing. Right? So we can kind of look at this as a set of grid lines, or as, maybe an Excel notebook, spreadsheet sort of situation, right, where we have rows and we have columns. And in setting our template, what we're doing is we're setting the different widths of our different columns and the different heights of our different rows, right? So if I wanted to start by default and say, okay, well, I want one column that's kind of short, one column that's kind of long, and one column that's kind of in between. Well, that's pretty easy, right? I can come in here and I can make a grid template columns, and I can define a width for each column that I want to have in my row. So if I want 3 columns that are all at different widths, maybe I can say one is 20 viewport width, one is 60 viewport width, which means we have another 20 viewport width to get back to 100. So let's change that to 10, and let's make the last one 30 viewport width. And so now we kind of have this size here. That we have ready for us. And if we want to declare a height on these, we can make a grid template rows, and this will give me a height for each row. Although we don't necessarily do that, right? Like, one of the things that we might do is use something here called min content, right? Which is the minimum amount, which is like saying, the min height, when we set the min height before. Max content, we have mid-max here. Right, so just for our demonstration purposes right now, I'm just going to put a singular number in here. Let's say 30 viewport height. So 30% of the viewport. So now if we look at our grid as it stands, right, all we did was save there. We see our different columns here, right? We have our first column, we have our second column, and we have our third column. And if we shrink our window, we see it stays those widths, right? Notice that we didn't declare any widths or heights for any of our grid elements, which makes this, kind of interesting. That we can work with that like that. And so each time, one of the things that we have to point out here is that we only have 3 columns in our columns there. So we only have 3 elements in a row. So if I change these, we'll just paste them in here, and we'll kind of swap around the classes here. So we'll make the first one blue, the second one red, and the third one yellow. We'll see what happens. Now, right now, we have a bit of an issue here, right? Because even though we have these sections and they're defined in our grid container, our template rows here causing us a little bit of problem. Right, so one of the things that we might want to do here is just simply remove this. We'll comment it out for our purposes here, just so you have it when I give you the output there, and we can see what happens here. Everything's gone away now. Right, so typically what one might do here is we would take and we would add this to a section tag. So in this case, we're only using our sections as the children here. So we can add a min height of, say, 300 pixels. And then we can run that in our code and see what that looks like instead. And there we have it, right? There we have all of our columns in here. Right? So once we adjusted the height to not have a templated area there for our height, or for our column, or for our rows rather. So our row doesn't have. So in that instance, we didn't have different rows. We only had one row there. So when we tried to add another row, it didn't do anything with it. But we can see that when we took that out, so we let our rows kind of be more fluid, when we added more sections in there, 3 more, it created myself a new row with those elements on it. And we can see here that as I make it more narrow or more wide, we can see everything's being adjusted and flowing accordingly. Now what's interesting about this, right, is we can actually create templates with this. So let's consider for a minute, well now, what if we were to create an even grid system, and instead of using these predefined column widths, let's use template areas so we can put different things in different locations and change things up a little bit. Right? And that's where we can start kind of really working with this. and making things really good. Right? So one of the things that I might want to use in this instance is a frame. So let's talk about frames. A frame is just a theoretical unit of measurement, right? So if I say that I have one frame going across, then that's the full width. If I have 12 frames going across, then I have 12 evenly spaced out columns, right? Even columns of even sizes. So if I wanted to build my column in this sort of way, what I can do here is something like this. So let's look at our code. So instead of building this out here to be that, I can build it out in frames. So if I were to do that relatively, right, I could say 1 frame, 6 frames, and 3 frames. Right, if I save that, we'd basically see the exact same thing here, right? And my frames are going to be a relative size based on how big my window is. Now, if I wanted 12 or 6, let's say 6. Let's say I wanted 6 evenly spaced columns apart on my screen. I can use the repeat property, and I usually get the repeat property a little backwards. So let's see if I can get it right this time. So I can say repeat, and I think I want to repeat 6 times 1 frame. I usually get these backwards. Let's see if I got it right this time. Oh no, I actually got it right this time. Right, so what we can see here is that I have red, yellow, blue, blue, red, yellow. Right, and we can change that second blue there to a green, just so we can see that just a little bit. Let's create ourselves a new class here, .green. And we'll make the background color here green. And then we could take one of these blues and just convert it to green. So we don't have 2 blues side by side. We can kind of see really easily what's going on here, right? So let's do that. So there we go. Now we have red, yellow, blue, green, red, yellow. Right? We can see our 6 columns across here. Pretty cool. And so now that I've done this, I have made a grid template. I have the columns for it. I can make the rows to be auto-sized, or I can just kind of let them go. Another thing that I might want to define here, however, is grid template areas. So let's say we want to make grid template areas. And one of the things that I'm going to do here is I'm just going to remove all of these sections here so we can see a different example. But I'm going to make grid dash template dash areas. And so using grid template areas, I can make different items to meet my different templates. And so I can have an item that spans across 6 elements, right? So let's try that. So what I do here is I say, okay, I'm going to make my grid template areas, and then I can just kind of establish my own areas. Typically, we just kind of want to refer to them as like we would otherwise. So I can hit enter here, and I can just put each line wrapped in quotes with some name for some template area. Right? So if I want a full width header to go across, I know I have 6 frames, so I can just type the word header in here 6 times. H-E-A-D-E-R, 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 H-E-A-D-E-R. Right, so now that I know that if I have an item that has the grid area assigned to it of header, then that's great. Right, it'll go there at the top and it'll span 6 rows. And I actually think I want to add a grid template rows auto here as well. Right, and we do the auto because it's going to be defined by our template areas. So in our body, we might want a sidebar and then maybe a main content area. So we can add a sidebar, main, 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 main. So now we have 2 width for the sidebar, 4 width for the main, 6 width for the header. And we can make a footer likewise. Footer, 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 footer. Full width footer. Right, so this is a little bit of a different way than we've kind of been used to doing stuff like this, but since these are all the same word, right, it's going to be everything put into there. So if I went and I added some things into my HTML here, let's say I added a header semantic tag, gave it an ID of, we'll call it site underscore head. Right, so now in our CSS, we can focus site underscore head ID. So that's hashtag site underscore head. We can give it a little bit of height, right? So we can say min height 200 pixels. We don't need to worry about the width. We just need to worry about defining it a grid area, which is going to be the header. And we'll give it some sort of color here. Let's give it background color orange. Right, so now let's make sure both of our files are saved. And there's our full width header. Right, even though our grid template is divided into 6 columns, since we set up our template areas the way that we did, then it's going to do that for me. Right, so now, if we had our sidebar, we can take and make a section here, give it an ID of like side. We'll call it side. Right, we'll close our section. We can also make a section, another section, and give it the ID of like, content or whatever. And close that off. Right, so now we have a grid container with a header. If we focused these elements in them, right, maybe we want to take that hashtag sidebar make the min height. In fact, let's change our min height of our head to be a viewport height element. So let's take that and make it like a 20 VH viewport height. And we can make our min height of our sidebar 70 VH. Assign it the grid area that it goes with, which is sidebar. So that is grid area sidebar and give it a background color of maybe brown. Right, so now if we look at it, we refresh. What have we done here? We might have to go ahead and put our main in here as well. Let's go ahead and put our... Oh, we called it side instead of sidebar. That's what we did. Bleh. That's why it's not working yet. If we do hashtag side here, then it's going to work. There it is. That's our sidebar. And our sidebar is going to adjust accordingly, right? By default, it's 2 frames, 2 columns of this 6 frame wide site. We can make it as tall as we want. Right, when our site's bigger, it's going to be wider. When it's narrower, it's going to be narrower. But it's still going to fit on the same grid system. And we can do the same thing with our main, hashtag main. We can define it a grid area of main. And we'll give it a min height of 70 viewport height as well. Now, one of the things that we might want to do here instead of that is to put these in a subgrid, right? Which would be kind of interesting to do here. Because we could make this its own subgrid where it stays the same height. Or instead of defining a height here, we could define grid template rows. So let's do that instead. We can make our grid template rows. I'm just going to take the min heights out of all of these. And our grid container will go grid template rows. Let's say 2 frames, 8 frames, 3 frames. Why not? Let's save that and see what we ended up with here. And so now we have some issues there. What do I want to do with that? Oh, I'm already doing grid template rows auto there. So let's undo that as well. Yeah, so there it is. So there it is by that default. I might just want to set them as viewport heights instead. So let's say 15 VH, 60 VH, and then 25 VH instead. There. So now our height here is being set by the rows that we've defined. 1 row, 2 rows, 3 rows. Right? That's what, that again is what we mean when we're saying, okay, this is a 2D arrangement, right? We have rows and we have columns. Let's go ahead and put our footer in here. Right, in our HTML, we can focus a footer here. So we'll put a footer here. We'll give it an ID of foot. So in our CSS, we can focus a hashtag foot. And we can assign it to the grid area. So in this case, that's going to be grid area footer, because that's what we called it up here. Right? We can call these grid areas whatever we want as long as we're consistent between our elements and our grid areas. So all we're doing is we're telling it how many of the columns to take up by giving the same name there every time. We can do that as well. So we can just make this a background dash color dark Let's go dark red. Dark red. So now we have... And brown looks pretty close to dark red. Maybe we want to change that brown a little bit there. Maybe instead of brown, or maybe just use a better brown. Warm it up a little bit. Something like that, maybe instead. Yeah, good enough. Right, it helps us delineate our different sections here. So this is our grid, right? And if we kind of took some stuff out of our grid here, like if I wanted to keep something empty, I can take these two out, replace them with periods, right? Because I have to have something to meet all 6 of the columns that I've created here. And so now I have an empty bit of real estate there. Which is pretty interesting, right? Like, you know, we can basically put anything wherever we want as we're dealing with this. It can be full width, it can be partial width. We'll add those footers back in. We put text in these different areas, right? Like, let's say if we were to put a header in the top there. In our site head, let's just put something like, oh, fall is here. Thursday, I believe, is the first day of fall. So we can just put a nice little fall header in there. Let's put it inside of an H1 tag as well. Just so we're kind of doing the right thing there, we can take and make that an H1. So now we have an H1 in our header. And let's style that up a little bit, right? So in our CSS, we can focus our H1. Let's use, for the color of it, let's use the dark red that we're using in our footer. Let's give it a font size of some viewport values, right? So that would be... let's try 12 viewport width. It's a little big. Right, so let's go maybe 6 viewport width. And let's add a little bit of padding to it. Padding. 12 pixels. Let's save that, see what that looks like. That looks pretty nice. So we have a fall is here, there. And if we want to make that smaller, it's going to resize everything automatically. Now, as we can see there, since we're using viewport height and viewport width, if our site gets a little more, it's a little too narrow there, right? We could see that could cause an issue. All right, because we are basically, at that point, you know, we're kind of out of aspect ratio. So we kind of want to give us, you know, if we're going to do something like this, which I don't always recommend, you know, we're going to want to give ourselves maybe a little bit of extra breathing room with that. We could also use I believe max content there is what I want. Max dash content. So if we got to that space now, right, where we got a little more narrow than we are tall, right, it's still respecting the content. Which is pretty cool. Right, there's all sorts of different different things that you can do with grid and grid content. Another thing that I might want to do here, for example, is now we have an issue with our footer, right? Like if our window gets too narrow, we can see our footer kind of comes up. We can use min-max values for that as an example of a solution for that. So instead of 25 viewport height, what I might want to do is say min-max 25 viewport height, comma 40 viewport height. Right, and so now it'll give me a value that starts out as 25 viewport height up to, but not including, or up to and including, 40 viewport height. And I think that'll work to solve that problem. Yeah, we can see that work to kind of solve that problem there. Same side as before, but now as we get more narrow, right, it's just filling up that space. And so we can kind of see all of that working there. We can make adjustments to this. We can make adjustments to this on the fly, right? Like if we decided that our sidebar is a little too big, maybe we want to add another main instead, right? And just like that, we've shrunk our sidebar, right? We can play around with the widths here. Right, because in this case, that might be a little too narrow. There are different options for what we could do there when we got that small. One of them is to use a media query, right? So we can do that as well. Let's refresh our memories of a media query, and let's try to do that. So that would be at media screen and min or max width let's say 600 pixels. So now inside of there we can look at our grid template areas. So we can take our grid container again, and we can just change the way that our grid template areas flow. So in this instance, what I might want is, let's say I want my columns to remain the same. I still want to be displaying grid, so that can remain the same. But instead, I might want to add another row. So we could say min max, maybe 10 viewport height, comma 15 viewport height. Or we could do the max content thing again, right? Max dash content. And now we've added an extra row, so we can take that sidebar and refocus it. Sidebar, 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 sidebar. So the sidebar is all the way across. And then we can have the main all the way across as well. So now if we get down to a certain width, that's going to jump to the top instead of being to the side. Right? Because when we get down too small, that is way too small, so we jump it to the top. And so that's a good thing that our media query does here. And we can see that it just shifts around our grid and everything's cool there, right? pretty neat. We actually might want it just a little bit bigger than that based on where our breakpoint should be. Let's say 790 here is our max width. So now when we have a big window, we can see our sidebar here is on the left at 790 pixels. We can see it jumps up to the top. We can see our heading up here at the top stays nice and good. What I might would do in some of these instances is just kind of adjust, like maybe add another breakpoint and make that a little bit wider, or any number of things. Right, and we do have documentation and things of that nature in your module that goes a little more depth into all of this. But in a nutshell here, what we've done is we've created a template for a website. And we can use this same template to make any number of websites, right? Just by just changing the colors and maybe adjusting a few things here. Right, like maybe I could put another media rule here for a little bit bigger. Maybe we can say 1024, so 1023 pixels. We get rid of that max content for our rows. And then on our second row, we make our sidebar take up 2 columns. So sidebar, sidebar. So now when we're really big, we're taking up 1 column. I've got my order of operations out of whack here, so I need to make sure I move this. Control X, Control V. Right, remember when you're doing your media queries, cascade rules still apply. So, you know, if it's below 790 pixels, it's also below 1023 pixels. So whatever you put at the bottom is going to take over at that point. So now when we're all the way that small, it jumps it to the top. We can see at this point here, right, where we're at roughly 1024 pixels to here. Right, it's double width, so we might even want to make that just a little bit bigger, and we can see it jump to single width there. About 1280 might be good for that one, so let's change that to 1275. Right, so now we can see that double width, and if we go out, it jumps to single width, and if we go way in, it jumps to that. We can min-max. We can change things. We've built a template, right? And this, you know, we can put a navigation in here, main content in here. Do it however we want, right? Because we've done it at that point. So there is another game in your module here for helping you learn the different components of grid, right? We've just touched on a very small number of them here today. Very, very small number of them to kind of build this demo site. There are a lot more of them that, you know, can really give you granular control of your different elements and different things like that. But just like you have Flexbox Froggy in your module, you also have a link to a game called Grid Garden that you can take time and play through and kind of figure out some more about grid using that. I will provide you this code along with my recording today, so you'll have access to that. I really just encourage you all to kind of play around with these things. Try to make some templates, right? Because if you can make some templates and make some good templates that'll work, You can go ahead and make 3 or 4 different templates and then have them ready to build sites with, right? Like, we made a template here, and we only made it in about 35 minutes because we started out with something else, and we changed up a lot here. Right, so that's all that I have for you for today. I'll hang out in the chat for a couple minutes with the music on, just in case anybody here with me live has any questions. If you're watching the recording and you have some questions here, send me an email and let me know. But for now, that's all that I have. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.